Gospel reading. I'm reading from Luke chapter 1, verses 24, 25, 39 through 45, 56 through 57. After those days, his wife Elizabeth conceived, and for 5 months she remained in seclusion. She said, "This is what the Lord has done for me when he looked favorably on me and took away the disgrace I have endured among my people." In those days, Mary set out and went with haste to a Judean town in the hill country, where she entered the house of Zechariah and greeted Elizabeth. When Elizabeth heard Mary's greeting, the child leaped in her womb. And Elizabeth was filled with the Holy Spirit and exclaimed with a loud cry, "Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the fruit of your womb. And why has this happened to me, that the mother of my Lord comes to me? For as soon as I heard the sound of your greeting, the child in my womb leaped for joy. And blessed is she who believed that there would be a fulfillment of what was spoken to her by the Lord." And Mary remained with her about 3 months, and then returned to her home. Now the time came for Elizabeth to give birth, and she bore a son. Matthew 2, 1 through 5, 7, 8, 10, and 12. In the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem asking, "Where is the child who has been born King of the Jews? For we observed his star at its rising, and have come to pay him homage." When King Herod heard this, he was frightened, and all Jerusalem with him. And calling together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. They told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it has been written by the prophet." Then Herod secretly called for the wise men and learned from them the exact time when the star had appeared. Then he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word, so that I may also go and pay him homage." When they saw that the star had stopped, they were overwhelmed with joy. On entering the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they knelt down and paid him homage. Then opening their treasure chests, they offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they left for their own country by another road. May God bless the reading, hearing, and living of his holy word this day.
Thanks be to God.
Before I forget, I want to let you know that 3 of the scenes of the Advent story, the Christmas story, are been depicted here by Ned Adams. And you can come up and look at these closer later if you'd like. There is a 4th scene that I'll be talking about that I added after I talked with Ned, so it's not Ned's fault that there's not pay. The 3 should be good enough for us. So last week we began our Advent season, and we began an Advent sermon series called Setting the Stage for Christmas. And I mentioned that Advent is a time of waiting, but it's not a time of doing nothing. It's a time also of preparation. And the preparation isn't just buying gifts and that kind of thing, but the preparation is getting our hearts ready to welcome the Christ child into our heart again. And so, using the metaphor of a stage, we'll be looking at the various aspects of the Christmas story. So last week, I'm going to catch you up if you weren't here. Last week we talked about erecting the backdrop, and that was looked at through the eyes of the ancient prophets of the Old Testament, those in particular Isaiah and Micah, who foretold of a Messiah that would come, that would bring justice and equity and hope to the people of Israel. And then we talked about how the partial fulfillment of that promise that God had made to send a Messiah happened when Jesus was born, but that we continue to live in a world where we need again to look toward a Messiah that will come and bring justice and equity and hope to the world, because those things have not been realized in total like they will be at the time that Christ comes again. So the people in the Old Testament longed for a Messiah. They longed for God's promises to be kept, and they longed for that Messiah to come. And we looked at how we then, understanding this and having the opportunity to look back and see how things happen, we have the opportunity then to become part of the promise keeping that God has made to the world, that we must work for justice, for equity, and for hope, and that is part of fulfilling the promise that God makes to bring those things to the world. And so this week we're looking at the next part of setting the stage for Christmas. We're looking at constructing the scenery. And if you've ever been to a play or in a play, you know that scenery is important for telling the story. It sets the mood or the atmosphere. It sets the parameters of what it is that you're hearing and seeing. And so scenery is very important. And it's very important as we look at the Christmas story. Now, if you've been to a play, you know that there are several times when scenes change. And normally the curtain closes and there's a lot of stuff going on behind the stage. And then when the curtain opens, you have a new scene, right? Well, I'm not doing that. We're not going to open and close curtains. You're just going to have to go with me when I tell you that it's scene change, okay? So we're going to be looking at some different scenes in this story. And normally I think when we think of the Christmas story, our imaginations goes right to the scene of the manger and the stable. But I want us to look at some other scenes that actually happened before that, because there are several locations where this story of Jesus' birth has its beginning, and I think that we need to look at those today too. So how many of you know what a sitting room is? You have sitting rooms in your homes anymore? Not so much. We probably call them living rooms nowadays. That's where living happens. You know, you have your TV and your stereo or your, I don't know, Game Boy or whatever it is that you do. Some recliners. Don't laugh, over there. We have, see, they're imagining their living rooms. So there's different things in there, and I would bet that the living room is not quiet because it's a living room, right? Well, the sitting room is, well, it's for sitting. It was intended in the old days to be a place where you went so that you wouldn't be disturbed. When you had company come, someone came calling, you would go to the sitting room, and that way you wouldn't be bothered by all the servants running around making noise, or nowadays the kids running around making noise. So you had a sitting room where you could be contemplative if you needed, have some time of quiet. Well, in biblical times, the homes weren't, generally speaking, weren't grand. Often they were just one room. But there were times when it was possible, I suppose, and we're going to assume this because of the story that we have in the scripture, that there was a place in this house that maybe it was just a corner away from the rest of the things, but that it was a place that was intended for a person to go and have some time of quiet. Perhaps, as I said, some time of prayer. A time when things would be quiet and you could concentrate on what it was that you wanted to do. So that's the first scene of our Christmas story. It's interesting, I think, that this sitting room was probably a place that Elizabeth had in her home, and the place that they, when Mary went to visit, the place where they would sit and have quiet, private time together. A place where Mary and Elizabeth could sit and have an intimate conversation, sharing the joys and concerns they had about becoming parents. You know, Elizabeth in her old age wasn't supposed to have a child, and Mary in her young age wasn't supposed to be having a child either. And you can imagine maybe what their conversations might have been like in that sitting room, as these two women sat together talking and sharing their feelings and emotions. We know from the scripture that Elizabeth recognized right away that something special was going on with Mary. And she began to see that Mary's understanding that God was doing this thing with her was an important part of Mary's life, and that Mary, she celebrated that Mary knew that it was God's will for her. And so as they sit in that room together, sharing and talking and doing the things that women do when they have these conversations, maybe they even sat together in silence and had a moment just to reflect. So the beginning of the story of Christmas, the Advent story, doesn't begin in a room where an earthquake shakes the floors. It doesn't begin in a place that's noisy and confusing, but it begins quietly in a sitting room with two women sharing with their most trusted friend the worries and the concerns about God's purposes for them. And so that's the first scene. And now the scene changes, and we're moving on. And I have a question to start this second scene. Who do you think would be named the first villain of Christmas? You don't have to say out loud, but some of you maybe thought right away of the Grinch. You know, the Grinch that tried to steal Christmas. That would be a villainous thing to do, right? What about Scrooge in Charles Dickens' story, A Christmas Carol? I'd say that was pretty villainous, the things that he tried to do to ruin Christmas. Well, there's certainly another one we could count, and that would be King Herod. He certainly deserves a nomination for trying to be a villain of Christmas, and we'll talk about him in a little bit. But there's some that might say that the first villain of Christmas could have been the man who uttered those infamous words, "There's no room for you in the inn." This man who didn't know who Mary and Joseph were created the first outcasts of our story. And this came at a time when Mary is about to give birth to her first child, the Son of God, no less. And so what would it have looked like for Mary and Joseph to come to that inn and then find out there's no room? Well, the inn probably had an earthen floor, and at some time during the day there would have been probably chairs and tables around, or some place for people to sit, come in and have something to eat or drink. And in the evening, what they did to make room for the people who stayed overnight was they just shoved the tables and chairs to the sides of the room, and everybody just kind of laid down on the floor. And so there they would have been, strewn around among the hay and whatnots, animals perhaps, bodies laying, sleeping and snoring. And we can imagine all we want to about how it might have been, but see that they didn't get to stay there because there wasn't room for them. Have you ever had that experience or sensation of not having a place to be? Or have you ever experienced rejection, of being told you don't belong or you don't fit in? That's also an experience of this Christmas story. Maybe if Joseph had flashed a bit more coin, or maybe dropped a name of a locally well-known person, maybe the scene would have been different. Maybe they would have found them room in the inn. And that's the second scene of Christmas. And now it changes again, and now we're in the stable. Maybe you've had an experience of being on a farm. You know how it is. Lots of things happening on a farm. Noises of animals, sounds and sights and smells of a barn. Maybe it's the aroma of straw or hay that gets you, or maybe it's the aroma of wood or leather, or maybe it's the essence of that wonderful manure that's mixed with everything else. Nowadays, we like the rustic idea, but we really would rather not have to smell it, right? But this is the scene, in my mind, with Joseph and Mary as they get busy and to settle in for the evening, as Mary then begins to give birth. And I can just imagine how hectic it must have been. It wasn't a silent night by any means, I don't think. Because if you can imagine being in the stable, you know, Joseph's trying to get Mary settled, and there's animals to take care of, and you know how animals are when something's going on, they want to be right there, they're curious. And so it must have been a very hectic scene that night that Jesus was born. And so we move on to the next scene. Now, there's something about in plays, especially if they're accompanied by orchestra or music, that you have an opportunity to not only change the scenery by closing the curtain and fixing things behind the curtain and then opening it again, but you also have an opportunity to signal that something dramatic is going to happen with music. And so you have that dun dun dun, you know, that kind of music. Well, that's what we'll be playing right now, because that's the scene that we've moved to. The scene that we might not want to have be a part of our Christmas story. It's one of those scenes where the main character of this scene is kept off stage while the ominous music plays, giving the clue that something is going to have a major impact on the story that we're going to hear. And in the Gospel of Matthew, we're introduced to that off-stage character, Herod. And we hear about the part of the story of Christmas that we might not want to have be there. Now, Herod had been king of Judea for almost 40 years. And during his reign, he had done a lot of building and things like that to protect his legacy. He was also very quick to put to death people who opposed him, especially family. He didn't want anyone around him that he suspected might want to take his place on the throne. And so when we meet Herod and we come to the throne room, to Herod's throne room, it brings with it a sense of foreboding, even though we have the wise men and their regalness there too. Herod's greatness as a king didn't stem from him having a generous spirit or a loving heart. It came from years of surviving plot after plot, real and imagined, to have him lose his place on the throne. And so Herod was one of those folks that adhered to the idea that you were to win at any cost. And so he kept people on their toes, making sure they towed the line when it came to whatever he said. And we know in the story that when Herod first hears this news of a king being born, you can imagine what this did to him. He became frightened. It doesn't say that, but you know he was frightened. He was an old man who was hearing about a new king being born. And so with that story, he began to plot. This story goes to show how far a person will go that's obsessed with power to maintain their position. And it almost seems unfair to ruin the pageantry and the old holy night of Christmas by introducing this last scene, but it's a part of the story just the same. We really don't want to deal with the other side of reality. We really just want carols and candles and cradles, right? Herod tries to spoil Christmas. And maybe what Herod does is it reminds us of the contrasts that are brought to us by the birth of Jesus. God being born in a manger, what better contrast could there be? And all of the other scenes, including this place with Herod, are important to us understanding the Christmas story as it really happened. So in the sitting room with Elizabeth and Mary, perhaps we can ask ourselves how we can spend our time in quiet this season. How can we wait and listen and trust and hope in God's purpose for us? And maybe in the crowded inn, we will be able to find room to create a space so that Christ can come in and get into all of the busyness that's already around our lives. And in this stable, maybe we can be reminded that Christ was born into the world just as it was, smells and all, into our lives just as they are, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And maybe the throne room of King Herod reminds us that power is based on fear, and that only works when the people give in to fear. But you see, once we realize that fear doesn't have the final say, when we decide to declare that grace and hope and love and compassion and mercy that came to us in Christ is what has the saying that new life is born. And we need to remember that in spite of all of that, the grief and the horror that came from the commands that Herod gave, Herod dies and Jesus lives. You see, the story of Christmas is a story of contrasts and changing scenes. But it's a story that reminds us that the one who had been promised to come did come. And that, my friends, is the truth that we can rejoice in.